This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Hindu's In Focus podcast. I'm Zubaida Hamid, your host for today. It's that time of the year again when exams are looming and students are stressed. Most students in India write a number of exams, from the final boards at schools to the multiple competitive tests that are attempted to try and get a seat at coveted medical or engineering colleges. The process is so difficult, lakhs of students competing for a few thousand seats, that coaching them for these exams has become a massive business at several cities across the country. Kota and Rajasthan, one of these hubs, has been in the news recently over student suicides. 26 students died by suicide last year, and this year there have already been 6 deaths. How can the mental health of students be protected at a challenging time in their lives? What should the role of parents, teachers, and other stakeholders be? What can be done to bring down the number of deaths by suicide? And what happened to the National Suicide Prevention Strategy that the Indian government announced in 2022? We delve into these questions and more with Dr. Soumitra Pathare, Director, Center for Mental Health Law and Policy. Welcome to the Hindu's In Focus podcast, Dr. Soumitra Pathare.
Pleased to be here.
Doctor, there have been 6 student suicides in Kota this year already after last year's high figure of 26. You have said previously that coaching centers are a symptom of the problem and not the problem itself. Could you explain this to us?
Right. 2 or 3 reasons why I said that statement. First of all, let's just take the number of deaths. You said last year, 25 students in Kota died by suicide. Put it in the context nationally, what does this mean? India had close to around 11,000 children, that is young people below the age of 18 who died by suicide in 2021 and 22. Now, if that is the number of kids who are dying by suicide and Kota contributes only 25, then the exclusive focus on Kota makes absolutely no sense at all. In fact, if you look at Kota's number totally in suicides from the NCRB data, there were 141 suicides recorded in Kota. This is including the 25 kids that you talked about. Now, Kota's suicide rate is actually half the suicide rate for the country. India's suicide rate is around 12. Kota's suicide rate is 6. So actually, Kota is not even a high suicide region. That's the first issue with saying, look, the focus on Kota does not make sense. The second issue is if you look at the causes of suicide nationally, of the 10,500 or 11,000 kids who died by suicide, what does the NCRB say as reasons for suicide? 25% of the times, those suicides are due to what NCRB calls family problems. Another 15% are due to what, again, NCRB's term for it is love affairs. And 11% of suicides are due to failure in exams. So presumably those 11% are in some way related to the education system. So if you put family problems and love affairs, and I'm presuming that love affairs also then has to do something with families not accepting it at all. So 40% of the suicides are really due to family related issues. And 10% are due to education-related issues. So this is not to downplay the fact that education is important or not important. The issue is that the family relationships and family systems and family problems probably contribute to more than half of the suicides across the country. Now, again, we are not really paying attention to that. And the third issue is that the coaching classes in Kota are, again, a symptom of the failure of our education system. What do I mean by failure of our education system? Why do you have these coaching classes? Because fundamentally, the number of seats available in good institutions, I wouldn't even call them premier institutions, but good institutions, is so dramatically limited that the competition to get in is very high. In fact, if you look at Harvard, which is one of the best universities in the world, it has an acceptance rate of 4%. What does that mean? That of the 100 people who would apply to Harvard for an admission, 4% get accepted. Our admission rates or acceptance rates for things like IIT and all are less than 1%. It's easier to get into Harvard today than it is to get into an IIT. And while people think, oh, that means that the standards are high, I don't think that's what it means. It doesn't mean the standards are high. It just means that you have such limited supply. And so the education system's failure is now being reflected in these coaching classes. So, these are the three reasons why I think that the coaching classes and Kota and other places like Kota, and there are a few other places like Kota which don't make the news, are really a symptom of the problem that we have. And the problems we have are twofold. One is family related issues, and second is the education system. But the education system, from the perspective of just having a very chronic and extreme shortage of opportunities for young people.
Talk to us a little bit more about the family problems that you mentioned, Doctor. You said that a lot of this comes from NCRB data, which, of course, is the only data we have when it comes to suicides and accidental deaths. First, how reliable is this data? And second of all, talk to us a little bit more about the family issues that you mentioned.
The NCRB data has always had problems in many ways, and I won't go into the details of the problems. But one thing that we know for sure, for example, is that the NCRB data underestimates the suicides in our country and underestimates it by anywhere between 30% to even 90%, depending on which authority or research study you look at. What it means is that if we have like 100,000 suicides a year or 200,000 suicides a year, they are probably anywhere between 30% to 90% less reported, which would really mean that our suicides might be somewhere between 250,000 to even something like 400,000. So that's the first thing, the underreporting. The second thing is that the way NCRB categorizes the data is also very problematic. For example, if you look at when it says occupation, under occupation, two of the categories in the under occupation are housewife and student. Okay. And NCRB only gives one exclusive categorization for each individual. So, an individual can't be categorized in two categories. So how do they decide someone's a housewife? So if you have a farm laborer woman, will she get classified as a farmer? Will she get classified as a housewife? And let's say if she was even doing some education activities, will she get classified as a student? So this is just an example that very often NCRB's categories for classification are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And that really means who decides that this farm laborer woman would be classified as a farmer or as a housewife. It's really left to the constable in the police station where that suicide is recorded. We have no evidence. In fact, we have good evidence to actually say that these constables do not receive any particular training. So it's in that sense completely random how it will get classified. I mean, one thing that the NCRB data is probably pretty reliable about is the state where it happened. So if a suicide is reported, say, from Maharashtra, then you can be 100% certain that it did happen in Maharashtra. The other thing that it might be reliable is maybe the gender calculation, although you see it doesn't count. It has transgenders, but very few are reported there, but the gender might be okay. And the third is probably the age, because it puts it under broad categories of age. But beyond that, a lot of the NCRB data is really problematic. And that has more to do with the fact that NCRB is a police agency. It records crimes and it records data from the perspective of how the police or the criminal justice system want to look at data. And we've been arguing for the longest time that actually suicide data should be collected by a public health agency. Because it is a public health problem, it is not a law and order problem. Because we don't see it as a public health problem, you also have this other anomaly that the NCRB data has, which is that the NCRB data does not actually collect data on attempted suicides. If you look at attempted suicides in the NCRB data, it's missing in the suicide category, but it is there in other criminal category reports that NCRB publishes. But for a year in which we had close to about 170,000 suicides, the NCRB only will record something like 1,000 attempted suicides. Why is that? Because this is only people who are charged under 309 who will get recorded as an attempted suicide. And that's another problem. So while there are a lot of problems with NCRB, the only thing that is in a sense good about the NCRB data, and given the fact that it's the only data we have available, is that they don't change their methodology year on year. So while the absolute numbers may not work out very well, if you are comparing it from year to year, probably it is reliable in that comparison. It's reliable when it compares from year to year, but not necessarily reliable in the absolute numbers that it reports. So that's the real problem with the NCRB data. Again, with and turning to your second part of the question with the family records, family disturbances being recorded as a cause of suicide. Again, NCRB doesn't give us any distribution of what is called as family problems. What is family problems? What are things that are included under family problems? That is not even given to us by NCRB. One assumes that the police constable who filed the report arrived at a decision that it was family problems. And how do we know? Again, here they use exclusive categorization. So how do we know that somebody's death, which is recorded at, let's say, love affairs? What does it mean, love affairs? I mean, love affairs leading to a family problem. So then why is it under love affairs and not under family problem? How do they decide where will they put that in? And that's why I said it might be better to clump some of these categories together, because people might have multiple reasons, or these reasons might lie along a pathway. And how did NCRB pick up one bit of the pathway? What they also don't realize is, and NCRB definitely doesn't know this because it's not a public health agency, is that suicide is never down to one little thing. It might be the final straw, so as to speak, but there will always be many things that happen in the background. And to give you an example, let's say somebody is suffering from financial distress, then they lose their job, then they start drinking, and then one day they come home and have a fight with their wife, and they go off and kill themselves. Now, in this case, what would you put down as the reason? And my worry is that in different police stations, different police constables are probably putting down different reasons. You could say, oh, it was a financial difficulty, they had debt. Or it was maybe they lost a job and that's the reason. Or maybe they had a fight with their wife is what the reason you would put in. And in principle, all three of them are right. But it also shows you that trying to categorize the reasons for suicide as one single unitary cause is very difficult, because suicides lie along a pathway of things happening to people over a period of time.
So that one immediate catalyst which they might write down as family trouble because the person had a fight with his wife is not necessarily correct.
Exactly. It may not necessarily be correct, or it may be correct in some sort of way, but you then missed out many other important issues. Or worse still, they might actually just put it down as a debt problem, and not record the fact that they've been abusing alcohol, for example, or the fact that they've been having a lot of fights with their spouse because they've got financial debt, for example. So it could be a combination of reasons, but the fact is that the NCRB only attributes it to one reason, because they don't put multiple reasons as cause of death for each suicide. They put one reason as the cause of death. And so how proximate is the cause that they're going to take? Now, a policeman in the story I gave you, a policeman in one place might say, oh, fight with the wife. So they'll just put that down as the reason. Another policeman might say, oh, loss of the job as the reason. And a third policeman in some other state might actually put down that reason as a financial debt. Now, these are all separate categories in the NCRB as causes of suicide. So it becomes very difficult to say, oh, these are exclusive causes, because they're not exclusive causes. But the NCRB will record them as exclusive causes. And again, because the policemen are not trained in any way, different policemen across the country might record any of these four things as the exclusive cause. And that really is a problem in terms of the reliability of the data. And we've also been asking NCRB frequently, to saying to them, why don't you release the raw data, as in whatever data that you collected on the suicides, put out the raw data. It can be de-identified. It doesn't need to be identifying the individual name or their location, but de-identified data, because it will allow researchers like me and others to actually look for relationships or connections. Now, NCRB doesn't put out that data. So that's other problem that we have, that we can't really do a reanalysis of that data and see what else could be extracted from that data that we have.
Going back a little bit, Dr. Pataria, to the reasons that we talked about, apart from academic pressure, there have also been reports from students who have died by suicide talking about the financial burden. So, a lot of parents get into debt or spend a large amount of money to send their children to these coaching institutes. Does that also impact the psychological well being of the student who is there?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because you can imagine families saying to kids, saying, "Look, we are putting in a lot of sacrifice, and we are taking on a debt, and now you better, perform very well and make it worth our while to do it." Which then means that the student who's trying to sit for that exam has to not only perform for their own sake, but they also have to perform because they have this added pressure of their family's expectations. So that's one level of family expectations. The other level of family expectations is parents who say, "Oh, I did not get a chance to do it and I would have loved to do it, but you are now in a position where I'm giving you the chance." So, like vicariously experiencing success through their children, where the children are supposed to fulfill all the needs in terms of success that the parent was unable to do in their own life. And that's another level of pressure. The third level of pressure on young people is where parents will be saying, "Look, if you don't get into an IIT or a medical college or something, you will never get a good job, and you will always remain poor, and you will remain in the same state that we are in." So that's another added pressure on the young people, saying that, "Oh my God, if I don't get this, that's the end of the world. My career and my life forever is completely ruined." And families sometimes make it sound very desperate in the hope that that will spur the young person to work harder. But that can work both ways. In most instances, it actually doesn't spur the young person to work harder. It probably puts so much pressure on the young person that they actually give up. I mean, we all know this. If you feel that something is just way beyond your abilities, you're not going to get it. What you do is you just stop trying because you think, forget it, no point trying, I'm not going to make it. So too much of pressure for success can also mean people just give up trying. And so many young people might just actually give up trying because the pressure to succeed is so high and they feel that they are not likely to succeed. So families, and I wouldn't blame families alone, because it's not like the families in this case are the villains. The reason why families are doing this is because families are also acutely aware that, say, for example, career opportunities, future economic prospects for that young person are linked to what happens. And that's the unfortunate part of it. So, we have to, in many ways, everyone in this ecosystem, starting with the student, the families, and the even the coaching institutions, for some instance, are actually, there's no villains in the piece, if I may put it that way. Everyone is driven by a certain thing where they are part of a process in which they don't have much control over what is happening with the outcomes. And so it's, instead of looking for villains in the piece, and I always get very worried when there is a suicide, then everyone gets into this blame game thing. The blame game being, "Oh, it was the employer." I mean, recently there was an episode of someone at a very reputed company dying by suicide, and then everyone said, "Oh, it's the pressure of the employer that put on them, and that's why they died suicide." This idea is that the idea that you have one solitary cause and one person or one organization or one particular individual whom you can blame for it. It just doesn't make sense. Anyone who works in the field of suicide will tell you that the blame game does not make sense at all, because it is rarely one thing anyway. So to try and pick up on an individual or to pick up on an organization and blame them completely for it makes little sense. I think what we should really be looking at is structural issues. We should be looking at structural issues as in the lack of educational opportunities for children, or the lack of job opportunities, or the fact that maybe there's been this issue, for example, with online gambling and suicide deaths. I mean, what are we doing about that, for example? So there's a whole range of things that we need to be looking at, but it becomes very easy to identify just the most proximate cause and then to blame that proximate cause, whether it's an individual or an organization. Oh, he had a fight with his wife, and so the wife is to blame for it. Or the organization had some pressure to deliver on for work, and so now that's the reason why they died by suicide. I think it's a very very narrow way of looking at it. And also, this blame game does not actually help anybody. I mean, who does it help? It doesn't help change the system, and it spotlights an individual or an organization for a few days while it's in the media, after which everything dies down, and we don't actually address the systemic problems that exist, which are leading people to attempt suicide or even die by suicide.
Talk to us a little bit about prevention measures, Doctor. We know that the Rajasthan government brought in measures including a police helpline that students could call, training for hostel wardens to spot signs, banning coaching institutes from publicizing results. Do parents also need to be counseled in this entire ecosystem, as you said? And also, what are the actual measures that have worked when it comes to prevention?
Well, I mean, absolutely, every stakeholder needs to be part of what is done. Now, it's very difficult to fault anything that the Rajasthan government did or has done, because those are pretty sensible, eminently sensible things that you would want to do. But leaving out the parents is actually not such a great idea. And so, getting parents involved is probably important. But fundamentally, the thing that Kota represents is, if you look at it, there are lakhs and lakhs of students who are vying for this 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 odd seats. The ratio of who is likely to make it is so low that you are not going to make it. Now, the easiest thing for say coaching institutes to do, or for governments to do, is to limit those students. Okay, you have some way of having the students assessed at a point in time where somebody will be able to say, listen, you have very little chance you're going to make it given where you are, so you might as well not go to Kota and do this coaching classes at all. Now, that's unlikely to come from the coaching institutions, for the simple reason that it's a business, and more the students they are, the more the money they make. So it's in a paradoxical way, it is in the coaching institutions' interest to have more and more students rather than to have less and less students. Now, that's another big issue. Again, parents need counseling, but what do you counsel parents? What do you tell parents? That, oh, don't put pressure on the kids. I doubt that is going to work. You certainly should be talking to the parents, but just telling the parents don't put pressure on your kids is not going to work, I think, or it might work for a few, but it may not necessarily work for all. And secondly, the other problem that you have with Kota, with all of these things that you would do, is that, let's be very clear, if there were 25 suicides and if you did all of these interventions, suicides are not going to go to zero. Okay. At best, you will get a reduction. The best of suicide programs in the world are able to reduce suicides by 20%, 40%, 50%, 60% at the most. That's and over a period of years. Okay, over a period of 5 years, 10 years, you do it, you get those reductions. So if the idea is going to be that they put in place all of these initiatives, and so next year suicides will be down to zero, is completely unrealistic. In a year, you might probably see suicides down by, I don't know, 5%, 10%. Now, if you think there are 25 suicides and they're down by 10%, you're going to see two less suicides, which could just be a variation which anyway happens every year to year. So what I'm trying to say is that everyone in this ecosystem needs to understand what these interventions are going to achieve and what is the time frame over which they're going to achieve. And fundamentally, they may not achieve anything at all because you're not addressing the broader structural issues. You're not addressing the issues of saying, why do people need to go to Kota? And that issue is not getting addressed. And until you do that, you may actually see no reduction in suicides. So that's the real challenge, I think, that governments have. And so what has happened, I worry about this all the time. So what has happened is that everyone feels that they need to be seen to be doing something rather than actually doing something. Doing something that will make a difference. I mean, I've said this repeatedly, that governments can actually do some policy changes which can make a huge difference to suicides. And Tamil Nadu is the best example of it. In 2004, Tamil Nadu introduced introduce a supplementary exam after the board exam results. So, once the board exam results come, if you fail, you can sit for the exam immediately within the next 2 or 3 weeks again. And if you pass, then you go along with your peers. You don't lose your year, and your mark sheet does not show that you failed. And that over 10 years, over when data was collected from 2004 to 2015, over a 10-year period, it reduced suicides by 50% when the number of students taking the board exam doubled, which means really it reduced suicides by almost 75%. Now, that's something that took 10 years to achieve. But there are policy initiatives that governments can do from our own country which can reduce suicide, and this is an example from the education sector. Now, the interesting thing about the Tamil Nadu example is that you would have thought that every state in the country would adopt it, which is not true. Very few states have actually adopted the Tamil Nadu model of a supplementary exam, although there is such strong data and it's nearly a 20-year-old experiment to tell us that suicides drop dramatically after board exams. Not all states in the country have achieved it or have done it. So, again, our policymakers seem oblivious to the most evidence-based solutions that are available, for which there is good evidence and which require very minor policy tweaks. The policy tweak of having a supplementary exam did not require any large investment of infrastructure. It meant that you just repeat the exam for a few people and you already have the infrastructure to hold those exams, so it becomes very easy to do it. We don't do that. On the other hand, we try to kind of say, oh, let's start this helplines during board exam results and all. And I think that fundamentally is because of how our policymakers and how our society sees suicide. We see suicide as an individual problem. We see suicide as a problem of that individual. Oh, this vulnerable individual, he died or she died by suicide. We need to focus on that individual. Whereas many, look at the suicide literature or talk to anyone who works in the suicide prevention field, they will tell you that that's not true. There are a lot of structural issues and broader societal issues which actually need to be addressed. And frequently, if you address those issues, you'll get much larger reductions in suicide rather than to try and focus on people who are feeling suicidal. Let's say even if you wanted to focus on the individual, what is the best way to focus on individual? One of the highest risk factors of death by suicide is somebody who attempts suicide. So if somebody has attempted suicide, they have the highest risk of dying by suicide in the following 12 months. So actually, if you wanted to identify a high-risk group at risk of dying by suicide, that's your high-risk group. And you would be better off, targeting your limited resources towards that particular high-risk group rather than trying to spread it widely across all of the students and really then not reaching the ones who are most likely to be at need. So again, when we focus on the individual, we don't actually focus on individuals in a data-driven way. And if we did that data-driven way, then we would probably be able to do a much better job of it.
Talk to us a little bit about the National Suicide Prevention Strategy that was launched in 2022, aiming to reduce suicide mortality by 10% by 2030. It's been about a year and a half now since the strategy came in. Are we on track, anywhere close to reaching the goal? How has the implementation been?
Well, look, there's nothing wrong with the National Suicide Strategy. It's a strategy which is based on evidence. It is a strategy which is based on what we know about suicide prevention, and everything in it is good, and there's nothing wrong with it. The problem with the National Suicide Strategy is not its contents, but its implementation. In the sense that, as you said, it's been 18 months and we don't see any implementation happening. Now, that's really the problem. And that has been the problem we've always faced with suicide prevention. Lots of lofty ideals and lofty goals and lofty strategies, but nothing implemented on the ground. Again, I didn't see in the National Suicide Prevention Strategy while it's easy to set a target, how do you meet the target if you're not going to attach some money to it? And is that something they've estimated? I don't know if they've estimated. I'm hoping they've estimated that so that they know, okay, to reduce suicides by 10%, we are going to have to, invest X or Y or Z amount of money. So in the absence of implementation, how do we, how can we even say, oh, the national suicide strategy is not working? I mean, we've not even implemented it. How do we know it's not working or working? And secondly, the target itself. You see, India has signed up to the SDG goals, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals say that the target to reduce suicides by 2030 is one third reduction in suicides. Okay. And that's an indicator that they actually have in the SDGs. One third reduction in mortality due to suicides over a 10-year period, which means you take the 2020 data as baseline and you look for a 30% reduction from there. What has actually happened in India since 2020? Our suicides were up by 10% in 2020, up by another 27% in 2021, and now they are up by 4% in 2024. 3 years out of the 10 years gone, and our total suicides are actually up by close to around 20% or so, if not more. So how are we now going to reduce the suicides in the next 7 years by 30% on the 2020 number? Because your 2020 number, if it was 100, it has already reached 120, and you are supposed to get down to 70, which means you're going to require a huge reduction of 40% or 50% in the next 7 years, which looks completely unlikely. And on one hand, while we've signed up to the SDG goal of 30%, the National Suicide Prevention Strategy says, oh, we'll only aim to reduce suicides by 10% by 2030. You would say that, oh, yeah, that's a realistic goal rather than 30%. But again, 10% from where? 10% from the 2020 number, 10% from the 21 number, 10% from the 22 number. Which number are we going to use as the baseline to say the 10%? That again is not very clear to me. So while all of these ideas are great, what we need is implementation. And if you're not implementing anything, and as I said to you earlier, if you implement suicide prevention strategies, you don't see benefits within a year, 2 years, 3 years. It can take 4 or 5 years or so for these strategies to actually lead to benefit. So if we want to bring down suicides by 10% in 2030, we need to actually be implementing all of those things today to ensure that the suicides will be down by 10% in 2030. And if you're not doing anything today, you can be certain that you're not going to be down by 7% or 10% in 2030. So, you can almost predict right away that suicides are not going to be down by 10% in 2030 because we are not doing anything to actually bring them down. So we have a strategy which is existing mostly on paper. A lot of the initiatives that the strategy requires do not cost a lot of money, and yet we are not doing that.
Tell us, final question, Doctor. Tell us what you would tell parents of young 16, 17-year-olds who are perhaps going to go to college or preparing for important exams. What is it that you would tell them to help protect the mental health of students?
I think, I could tell parents many things, but it also depends which parent are you talking to. Are you talking to the parents of kids who are very high functioning, where you'd probably advise them very differently? Or are you talking to the parents of children who are averagely functioning? Or are you talking to the parents of children who are very poorly functioning? Because the advice you would give to parents would vary dramatically differently depending on which category of parents you're talking to. One. Secondly, it would also depend on what is let's say the socioeconomic status of the parents. I mean, are you talking to the parent of someone, or are you talking to parents who are extremely well off, let's say, and what would you be advising them? And are you talking to parents who are, say, middle class, or are you talking to parents who are working class or laborers or farmers who are just about living at subsistence level? What would you tell them would again differ very dramatically because you would factor that in. So, there's no one single advice that one can give to parents. And if we really wanted to work with parents, then we would take these issues into account when we are talking to parents. Now, I know you'll say, oh, even despite all of this, why don't you give me a solution? There isn't one solution, and I wouldn't want to venture into that. What I'm trying to get you to think about is that let us target the message to the audience you're talking to. And if the parents are the audience, then we need to understand that audience. It's not a homogeneous audience. It is a very heterogeneous audience. There will be young parents, there will be older parents, there will be urban parents, there are rural parents, there are parents who might be, directors of companies, and there will be parents who are farm laborers. How can you have one single message to deliver to parents? If you're going to talk to parents, then we really need to tailor that message to whichever category that these parents are coming from. And that's really what it is. So instead of telling parents what to do or not to do, I think the way to look at it is we should be asking ourselves, the question should be slightly different according to me. The question should be, how can we support parents so that they are better able to support their children when they're going through what is obviously a very stressful period in that child's life, which is about careers and about educational opportunities. And that support for parents will differ very much depending on where that parent is positioned.
And that's something that also needs to come at the policy level, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the policy needs to really say that, look, we will try and tailor these messages differently to different parents, and get them to understand things differently. And, I mean, like the problem, I can see where the problem for Rajasthan government comes in. Most of the kids who are studying in Kota don't actually come from Kota. They come from all over the country. They frequently come from very low resourced families, families who are not very well off. And so how do you even find and address these parents who are all over the country, and what kind of resources will you need to put in there? So this we need to understand that the quota is not just a Rajasthan government problem. Quota is a problem for every state government, because especially governments from the states where many of these young people are traveling to Kota. But we kind of make it sound like, oh, this is a Rajasthan government and a quota issue. It is not. It's an issue for all other states. There are a lot of young kids who go to Kota from, say, UP, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, Maharashtra. It's a problem for all of these states, and all of the state governments need to have an equal engagement and involvement in what is being done in Kota, and not just leave it to the Rajasthan government to say, oh, that's your problem, you deal with it. Because it isn't. Kota and Rajasthan are at the receiving end, in a sense, of problems which are getting generated across the country, in families across the country, in different states across the country.
Thank you so much for speaking to us today, Dr. Kothare.
Thank you.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.